A federal grand jury has indicted State Senator Leyland Yee. He's the Democrat representing San Francisco. Well, more than 24 other defendants were indicted yesterday as well. They were the subjects of an FBI investigation into several crimes, including drug and weapons trafficking and murder for hire. Prosecutors say State Senator Yee accepted bribes. His colleagues in the state Senate suspended him earlier this week. And joining us now to talk more about this is Professor Fernando Guerra from Loyola Marymount University. We want to welcome you back to the show. And so how will the suspensions impact the elections for, say, governor, state legislature, and Congress?
Well, I have very little impact on the governor's race because the Democrat Jerry Brown is so far ahead. Interestingly enough, for these three legislators, Yee, Calderon, and Wright, none of them were up for election, and so it won't impact them. They're in heavily Democratic districts. We expect Democrats to win their seats, whether they're termed out, whether they get recalled, whether they get somehow have to leave the legislature. Interestingly enough, it impacted with Yee having to leave Secretary of State, and that's the one election where they're talking a lot about these issues because the Secretary of State controls elections, ethics, contributions, and things of that nature. And so that's where you're seeing it as well. But also, it might impact the state Senate in, let's say, a district in Orange County or one in the Central Valley that the Democrats have, where it's a little bit conservative, and that's where they may lose, quote unquote, their supermajority.
And why is a supermajority so important?
Supermajority, obviously, there's 40 state senators, 21 you have a majority, 21 to 19. But if you get to 27, one party, they have 2/3, and they can pass legislation without considering a single vote of the other party. And they could put things on the ballot, they could pass taxes, they could pass the budget. But the supermajority only works for the Democrats if the state Senate has a supermajority, the state assembly, and they have the Democratic governor. Well, they've had all three, but they're worried about losing it in the state Senate. Okay,
and what reforms are being discussed in Sacramento given the suspensions?
Well, number one, people wanted to get rid of them, but they could only suspend them, and they're still getting paid. So there's legislation right now to be able, because right now it's against the rule. You either got to kick them out completely, and some of them haven't yet been, quote unquote, convicted, so they have to worry about that. So there's some legislation about that. There's legislation that you shouldn't be able to raise money while you're going through the budget and bill, so that there's a quiet time and that you only raise money during that campaign, but not when you're considering legislation.
And we want to move on to donor limits. You know, what is the practical impact on most donors or contributors?
So the U.S. Supreme Court just ruled that you cannot put limits on donors. You can still put limits on what a congressional candidate receives. And so the limit was $123,000 that you, as a contributor, were limited. That means that you could give to about 50 members of Congress the max, which is $2,600. This allows you to give anybody as much as you only stole $2,600, but to as many as you want. And so most of us don't give $123,000, and it takes about $300,000 because it's not tax deductible for you to be able to give that. So it's an amazing decision. It's clearly shown that the Supreme Court is against trying to have the influence of money, and that they equate voice with money, and those with more money have more voice.
And how will it actually impact California congressional elections?
So in the last election 2 years ago, the Democrats captured about 3 or 4 more congressional seats. Some of those were held by Republicans, and Republicans believe they can get those back. Those are going to become very competitive, and you're going to see a ton of these big-time donors giving money in these congressional seats. By the way, only about 500 contributors ever made it close to that limit. So this rule really only impacts about 500 Americans, and yet it's going to have a big significance.
Do you think it's going to impact elections on a more local level, say with the mayor or city council?
Interestingly enough, the city of Los Angeles has very similar donor limit contributions, meaning that you can give $700 to a council member running for election, or $1,400 to a mayoral or citywide election, but collectively you could only give X amount that prevents you from giving $700 to each candidate. And it's a very similar law. So the Supreme Court said you can't do that at the federal level. If somebody sues the city of Los Angeles, they will probably win and get rid of donor limits at the local level.
All right, Professor Fernando Guerra, thank you so much for your insight.